That morning in San Diego, California, I was standing quietly in my kitchen, holding a cup of warm tea and watching the sunlight fall across the tiled floor. My body ached in familiar places, reminders of the 35 years I had spent working as a nurse before retirement. This house had been my refuge for decades, a place I had paid for with double shifts, sleepless nights, and endless sacrifices. Yet lately, it no longer felt like my home. It felt like a place where I existed only when I was needed. The front door opened without warning, loud and careless. My son Jake walked in first, followed closely by his girlfriend Sarah. Neither of them greeted me. Jake, now 32 and unemployed for years, pushed my chair aside to reach the refrigerator, snapping, "Move, Mom. You're blocking the fridge." The chair scraped against the floor, and I stumbled slightly, steadying myself against the counter. There was no apology, no hesitation. He began pulling out containers of food I had cooked the night before, saying they were taking the leftovers to a party. Sarah laughed casually, adding that I always cook too much anyway, as if my effort meant nothing. I tried to speak, to explain that the food was meant to last the week. But Jake cut me off with irritation written all over his face. He shook his hand at me impatiently and demanded my car keys, complaining that my car was blocking the driveway and guests were coming. The word guests echoed painfully in my mind. Strangers were welcome in my home, yet I was being treated like an obstacle. When I hesitated, Jake warned me not to start one of my moods, while Sarah settled comfortably onto the sofa I had bought, kicking off her shoes as though she owned the place. In that moment, years of denial pressed down on me. For 5 long years, Jake had lived in my house without working. I had convinced myself it was temporary, that a good mother supports her child no matter what. So I paid for everything: electricity, water, internet, groceries that cost nearly $400 a month. I covered repairs, gas, phone bills. And when his money ran out, I dipped into my retirement savings. More than $50,000 vanished. Money earned through decades of exhausting hospital shifts. Money meant to protect me in my old age. And now, in return, I was being ordered around in my own kitchen. When I refused to give him the keys and reminded him that this was my house, his expression hardened. He stepped closer, invading my space, and told me I no longer had a say. Then, without warning, he shoved me. Not hard enough to knock me down completely, but hard enough to remind me of my place. My tea spilled onto the floor. My heart raced, and Sarah laughed it off, calling me dramatic. Something inside me shattered completely in that instant. I realized I was no longer safe in the home I had built. I went to my bedroom without saying a word, my hands shaking as I grabbed my purse. I looked around at the photographs and memories lining the walls and understood a painful truth. Love had turned into entitlement, and my kindness had become permission for abuse. I walked out of the house, and no one stopped me. Jake didn't call after me, and Sarah didn't even look up. I drove aimlessly until my vision blurred with tears, then checked into a small roadside motel near the freeway. Sitting alone on the edge of the bed, surrounded by unfamiliar silence, I finally allowed myself to feel what I had been suppressing for years. With trembling fingers, I called my lawyer, Ms. Ramirez, and told her I needed to evict my own son. She asked if I was safe, and that simple question broke me. I told her I wasn't, but I would be. She explained that, since the house was legally mine, and there was no lease, we could serve a 30-day eviction notice and possibly pursue back rent. That night, lying awake in a cheap motel room, I stared at the ceiling and accepted the truth I could no longer ignore. I had not been helping my son, I had been enabling my own mistreatment. And from that moment on, I knew my life was about to change. The next morning, I woke up in the motel with a strange mix of fear and clarity. My body was stiff from the unfamiliar bed, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. For the first time, I wasn't waking up to cook for someone else, pay someone else's bills, or fix someone else's mess. I was waking up for myself. I made a weak cup of motel coffee and sat by the window, watching cars rush past, realizing how long I had been standing still while my life drained away. My phone buzzed repeatedly on the nightstand. Jake, Sarah, missed calls stacked on the screen. I didn't answer. Instead, I drove straight to Ms. Ramirez's office. She greeted me with calm professionalism and a quiet strength that instantly made me feel less alone. I told her everything: how Jake had pushed me, how they had taken over my home, how my savings had slowly disappeared. She listened without interrupting, then looked at me firmly and said, "This is not family conflict. This is elder abuse." Hearing those words out loud felt both terrifying and validating. By that afternoon, eviction papers were prepared. 30 days notice. No more free utilities. No more financial support. Ms. Ramirez explained that based on the length of Jake's stay and the money spent, we could also pursue back rent and stolen funds. The numbers were staggering: nearly $90,000 in potential claims. I signed the papers with steady hands, not because it didn't hurt, but because I finally understood that protecting myself was not cruelty. The following day, the papers were served. I wasn't there to see Jake's reaction, but my phone exploded minutes later. His voice was furious, confused, and panicked all at once. He demanded explanations, accused me of betrayal, and reminded me of everything I owed him as a mother. I listened quietly, then told him the truth: that being his mother did not mean sacrificing my dignity, safety, or future. When I hung up, my hands shook, but my chest felt lighter. Within days, the reality hit them hard. Utilities were shut off. Credit cards linked to my account stopped working. Gas stations declined payments. Grocery store purchases failed. The comfort they had taken for granted collapsed almost overnight. Sarah left angry messages, calling me heartless and cruel, claiming I had ruined their lives. But for the first time, their words no longer controlled me. During a meeting at Ms. Ramirez's office, another painful truth surfaced. Financial records showed that Jake had withdrawn nearly $10,000 from one of my accounts without permission. Money I had assumed was lost to emergencies had been taken quietly, deliberately. Hearing that hurt more than the shove. It meant this wasn't just dependency, it was theft. 25 days later, they were gone. Jake and Sarah packed what they could and left for Los Angeles, chasing another fresh start, funded by someone else's patience. I returned to my house after the locks were changed, walking through each room slowly, reclaiming my space. The silence felt unfamiliar but peaceful. For the first time in years, my home belonged to me again. I didn't waste time rebuilding only walls, I rebuilt myself. I joined a local book club, something I had always postponed because Jake needed me. I started volunteering at a senior center, helping people who, like me, had given too much for too long. I reconnected with friends I had neglected and rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under guilt and obligation. Months later, Jake reached out again, not for money, but to say he had started therapy. Our conversations are limited now, carefully guarded, and always on my terms. I love my son, but love no longer means self-destruction. Family is not a license for abuse, and motherhood is not a life sentence of suffering. Today, I sit in my kitchen once again, drinking tea in the same sunlight, but this time, I am not invisible. I am not afraid. I am not apologizing for existing. I finally understand that setting boundaries didn't break my family. It saved me. Life after Jake and Sarah left did not magically become easy, but it became honest. The first few weeks were the hardest. I would wake up at night, startled by silence, half expecting angry footsteps or demands from the hallway. Years of tension don't disappear overnight. My body had learned to live in survival mode, And now it needed time to understand that the danger had passed. I worked closely with Ms. Ramirez to secure everything legally. My bank accounts were restructured, access was locked down, and every document was reviewed. For the first time in decades, I knew exactly where my money was going and, more importantly, who it was no longer going to. We documented everything Jake had taken, not out of revenge, but protection. Ms. Ramirez reminded me gently that accountability was not punishment, it was reality. Emotionally, the guilt tried to creep back in. Late at night, questions would haunt me. Was I too harsh? Should I have waited longer? Was this what being a bad mother looked like? But every time doubt rose, I remembered the shove in my kitchen, the laughter, the entitlement. Love does not push. Love does not threaten. Love does not drain someone dry and call it family. I started therapy myself, something I had ignored for years because I was always too busy helping in those sessions. I learned a painful but freeing truth. I had been conditioned to believe my worth came from what I provided. As a nurse, a wife, a mother, I was praised for giving, not for existing. Jake had grown up in that environment, and without realizing it, I had taught him that my limits did not matter. Slowly, I began rewriting that belief. I rearranged my home, donated things that carried heavy memories, and painted the walls a warm, calm color. I planted flowers in the backyard and spent mornings outside, instead of rushing to fix someone else's crisis. Each small act felt like reclaiming territory, not just physical space, but emotional ground. Jake called occasionally, sometimes angry, sometimes quiet, sometimes apologetic. I listened when I felt strong enough, and I ended conversations when I didn't. Therapy had taught me that boundaries were not walls. They were doors I could choose to open or close. When he blamed me for his struggles, I calmly reminded him that adulthood came with responsibility. When he spoke with respect, I stayed. One afternoon, months later, I received a message from Sarah, not angry this time, but distant. She said she hoped I was doing okay and that things were hard. I wished her well and left it at that. No money, no promises, just closure. For the first time, I didn't feel pulled back into their chaos. What surprised me most was how much life I have left once I stopped living for others. I traveled. Nothing extravagant, just quiet places that allowed me to breathe. I laughed more. I slept better. I stopped apologizing for saying no. And slowly, the woman I had been before fear took over began to return. I learned that being alone does not mean being abandoned. Sometimes it means being free. I learned that motherhood does not require martyrdom, and kindness does not mean compliance. Most of all, I learned that it is never too late to choose yourself. Today, when I sit in my kitchen, the chair is steady beneath me. No one pushes it aside. The tea is warm in my hands, and for the first time in a long time, the house feels like home again, not because my son lives here, but because I do. Jake's life in Los Angeles did not turn out the way he had imagined. At first, he was confident, almost relieved to be away from rules, expectations, and the comfort he had taken for granted. He stayed with a friend, then another, always saying it was temporary. Temporary turned into unstable, and unstable slowly turned into desperation. Without my house, my money, and my silence to fall back on, the world stopped cushioning his mistakes. He called me less often, and when he did, his voice had changed. The arrogance was gone. In its place was exhaustion. He spoke about job rejections, about bills he couldn't understand, about how quickly people stopped helping once favors were no longer free. For the first time, he was experiencing consequences without a safety net underneath him. One evening, he called late. Not angry, not demanding, just tired. He told me he had started therapy after a panic attack at work, his first job in years, one he was already afraid of losing. He admitted something he had never said before. He didn't know how to live without being taken care of. That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. Therapy forced Jake to confront things he had avoided his entire adult life. He had to face how entitlement had replaced gratitude, how comfort had turned into dependency, and how control had masked itself as confidence. The therapist helped him see that love is not proven by how much someone gives up for you, but by how much responsibility you're willing to carry yourself. Our conversations slowly shifted. He began asking instead of demanding, listening instead of interrupting, apologizing without attaching excuses. He told me he finally understood how wrong it was to shove me, to speak to me with disrespect, to treat my home like a resource instead of a place built with decades of work and sacrifice. I listened, but I did not rush to forgive. Healing, I had learned, does not mean erasing the past. It means acknowledging it fully. I told him clearly that rebuilding trust would take time, consistency, and accountability. I would not rescue him. I would not finance his recovery. I would only offer what was healthy: conversation, honesty, and limited support that did not cost me my dignity. Sarah eventually faded out of the picture. Jake admitted their relationship had been built on avoidance and comfort, not growth. Without my house and money to stabilize their lifestyle, the cracks became impossible to ignore. It wasn't my job to feel guilty about that. Some relationships survive reality. Others depend on denial. Months passed. Jake stayed in therapy. He kept his job. He learned to budget. He paid his own rent. None of it was easy. All of it was necessary. And for the first time, I saw something real forming beneath the damage, not the child I once protected, but the adult he had resisted becoming. I also changed. I no longer waited by the phone. I no longer measured my worth by how needed I was. When Jake visited months later, it was by invitation, not assumption. He knocked, he waited. He thanked me for the meal. Small gestures, yes, but powerful ones. That visit did not erase the past, but it marked a boundary that had finally been respected. He sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I had once been pushed aside, and this time, he asked how I was doing, and he listened to the answer. I realized then that letting go had not destroyed my relationship with my son. It had saved it from becoming something toxic and irreversible. Sometimes, love only survives when control ends. And for the first time in many years, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before: not guilt, not fear, not obligation, but cautious hope. Time has a quiet way of revealing the truth. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, through behavior rather than words. Jake did not suddenly become perfect. He still struggled. He still failed sometimes. But the difference was this: he no longer expected me to clean up after him. Our relationship settled into something unfamiliar yet peaceful. We spoke once or twice a week, not out of obligation, but mutual respect. He shared his progress in therapy, his frustrations at work, and the small victories he was learning to appreciate: paying rent on time, cooking for himself, saying no to unhealthy friendships. These were things most adults take for granted. For Jake, they were milestones. I noticed changes in myself too. I had stopped apologizing for protecting my peace. I no longer felt the need to explain my boundaries to people who benefited from me having none. I slept better. I laughed more. I filled my days with things that belonged only to me: books, volunteering, friendships, quiet mornings with tea, and no fear of being disrespected in my own home. One afternoon, Jake surprised me. He asked if he could come over, not to stay, not to borrow money, not to ask for help, but simply to talk. When he arrived, he brought flowers. Not expensive ones, just simple, honest. He told me something I never thought I'd hear. I didn't lose my home that day. I lost my excuse to stay the same. That moment mattered more than any apology, because it showed understanding, not guilt. Growth, not fear. I told him something that had taken me years to learn. Love does not mean unlimited access. Being family does not mean permission to hurt. Support does not mean self-destruction. And forgiveness does not mean forgetting the lesson. Jake nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He accepted it. That was how I knew the change was real. Today, we are rebuilding not as a dependent son and an exhausted mother, but as two adults learning how to coexist with respect. Slowly, carefully, honestly. The past is not erased, but it no longer controls us. And if there is one truth my life has taught me, it is this. You can love someone deeply and still say no. You can choose peace without choosing loneliness. And sometimes, the bravest thing a parent can do is stop saving their child and start saving themselves. This wasn't a story about eviction. It was a story about survival, about boundaries, about dignity, and about the kind of love that finally tells the truth.